Welcome, everybody. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on whatever time zone you're in. We're so happy to be here learning with you again for our last session of Emotions in Halakhah with Rabbanit Victoria Sutton. I will wish Rabbanit Sutton a mazel tov on behalf of all of us before we start, because Rabbanit Sutton was one of the many incredible women Torah scholars who gained who were associated with Drisha, who gained a place on the Sefaria word by word fellowship in order to write a book of Torah scholarship. So this is our last class of Emotions in Halakhah, but we're so excited to continue learning and reading more of your Torah in the future. And with that, handing over to Rabbanit Sutton.
Thank you, Elena. So sweet. Thank you for the shout out and encouragement. And hopefully I'll be sharing a lot more Torah in lots of different venues. Just in case people pop off towards the end, just to highlight, this is the last night of this series. Next Sunday night in the same spot, but I think different registration link, correct? Different registration link. There'll be a one-off class on the Azharot in preparation of Shavuot. So Azharot, just to give a little background on that, and then we'll jump into the topic for tonight. Shavuot, celebrating the receiving of the Torah. Many people are familiar with the custom of reading the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments, but actually there is a custom dating back to the Geonim, so several thousand years. Reading poems of the entire 613 mitzvot. And it's a really beautiful custom, continues till today, a custom that my family does every Shavuot. So it's a custom that I'm excited to share about, and also some of the scholarship and some of the poetry behind it. Like, how do you take 613 mitzvot and turn it into poetry that rhymes and to a tune? So if you're interested in that, and we'll sing some of it next week, I'd love to see you back next week. So we've been spending the last 5 weeks looking at different emotions in halakha. We started with oneg Shabbat, the idea of like what creates that Shabbat feeling, that the rabbis created this overarching category of oneg, or pleasure, not only physical pleasure, but sort of what creates that sense of restorative Shabbat, enjoyable Shabbat, and that it was somewhat subjective. And we looked at a lot of different responses on that, including conversations that we maybe don't want to necessarily have on Shabbat about our jobs or about politics. And then we moved on the following week to the idea of simcha, of joy, that there's joy on holidays, there's joy in giving to others, that our joy is like almost enriched, or we feel more joy when we share with others. And then we looked at the idea of joy as being a sense of fulfillment or presence, right? How difficult it is to be present. And that the rabbis understood this concept of simcha, maybe in preparing for prayer or in about to do mitzvot, as presence and fulfillment. We then moved on to shame and embarrassment, and we looked at the idea of shame, both shaming individuals, but also as a society, how we become more aware of vulnerabilities of individuals, especially those who might feel more sidelined in society, and that the rabbis actually had models of takanot, or enactments that they put into place to standardize things, so that those who came in who were feeling vulnerable, maybe because of economic status or other status, were able to be on par with others and sort of not have to feel embarrassed. We then focused on the idea of embarrassing others and using social media in terms of giving feedback or bringing others to task, and also how that has been effective in some ways in get abuse, in challenging get abuse, and maybe that is something that would be encouraged use, right? Even though it's usually discouraged. Last week we looked at anger. And we looked at the idea that the rabbis understood that anger is a powerful, powerful force. And that's something that, although it starts internally, sorry that it's a little loud outside my block. Wait a second. Somewhere in Brooklyn. That it's a powerful force that starts inside, but often there's a need of the individual to get it out of their system. and that the ways, right, the more we let it take over us, the more we'll want to like get it out of our system, and that people sometimes want to destroy things or hurt other people, and think that, oh, that helps us feel better. And the rabbis recognize that as like a very powerful emotion that people had. I wanted to share that after last week's class, my daughter, who's 8, I shared that we were teaching about anger. And she said, and like, you know, and she's like, oh, like she basically said like she could teach the class, right, what to do with anger. I was like, yeah, what to do with anger. And like the rabbis talk about how bad, you know, like how when we get angry, you know, like we want to do things. Oh, so when you get angry, just like don't like kick or like do anything, especially if something's like can break or it's really delicate. So you can go and punch a pillow, or you can like stamp as much as you want, or you could just take some deep breaths. I was like, okay, maybe next time she'll teach the class on anger. But the rabbi sort of did have that hierarchy of like, we might want to do X, Y, or Z, but actually, right, that it's an emotion that the more we let it take control, the less we're able to control ourselves, unless we're able to make good decisions. And so in that vein, we're going to go session 5 tonight. Will be a little bit different than the others in that it's somewhat of an emotional state, somewhat of a psychological state, but it has to do with this idea of being completely overtaken, also and overwhelmed by a certain feeling. I know that the sources have been shared. I'm going to share my screen. Let me just pull up the source for a second. And just to remind everybody, I know, can you see what I'm sharing?
Yeah.
Okay. And it's in the chat. Just to remind everybody, and I know Lila has mentioned this, feel free to put questions in the chat. And if you are a panelist, you can also raise your hand and then be unmuted and be part of the conversation and participate. So it's great to have anyone who wants to participate. So we're going to look at this concept of these sort of two sides of a coin, of Yishuv da'at and Teruf da'at. Yishuv da'at usually is understood as settling or peace of mind after being kind of disturbed by something in a very deep way, gaining Yishuv da'at or gaining peace of mind, feeling settled. We're then going to look at the flip side of that, which would be Teruf da'at, which literally means from, right, people might be familiar with the word tref or teref, which literally means torn up. So Teruf da'at would be the opposite. It would be like when you're feeling so torn up, like your mind is just in a million different places, and right, there's sort of a scale of emotions that it could, or mental states that it could encompass. We're going to look at two cases. The first case is going to be the ways in which the halakha makes exceptions for a woman in labor. I'm going to give a little background to that. And the second case is going to be people who have illnesses, and sort of how we worry about a person's state of mind and what information will do to a person's state of mind, and how Halakhah looks at that. So the first case is quite interesting. As background, there's a general sense that, and many of you might be familiar with this, there's a general sense that we have a concept of pikuach nefesh, dochet Shabbat, that saving a life is the most important thing. And then whenever somebody is in danger, there's something that's potentially life-threatening, that it's like Shabbat gets pushed aside, it doesn't exist, and we can break any rules of Shabbat in that case. Right? There could be many, many examples that could come up, and the rabbis discuss sort of what's the realm of potentially life-threatening, right? How broad does that go? And what are the like steps that one can take to get care versus like violating Shabbat completely, right? Asking someone in a rabbinical level, doing rabbinical prohibition, right? So there's a hierarchy. What's interesting about the first case, about this case of a woman in labor on Shabbat, is that on the one hand, although it's clear that she is perhaps in danger, right? That especially before modern medicine, even with modern medicine, unfortunately, if people read the statistics, that labor and post-delivery is actually quite a dangerous, vulnerable and dangerous time for women. right? And that there was high maternal mortality, and it's unfortunately still even too high today in this country. So that's something that we want to make sure a person gets the best medical care possible. What's fascinating about this case that we're going to look at is they're not only concerned about the medical care. It's not only about making sure that there is a doctor or a midwife or getting that person to the doctor or the midwife and doing the medically necessary things to make sure that the woman is safe and that the baby is safe and that everything happens in a safe way. But actually, we're going to see that there's also a concern for how she's doing, how she thinks, what she thinks she needs, what she thinks might help. Even if it's not necessarily something that is medically needed, and might actually be quite unnecessary. We're going to see the first example in the Mishnah, which is very, very, very striking, especially if you're familiar with the rules of Shabbat. So the first source, which you should have, it's on the screen, and if you want to look at it on your own, this is from a Mishnah based on a Mishnah on Shabbat that said that you can light a candle for a woman who is in labor, even if she asks for it. And they're sort of going back and forth about this lighting a candle. Right? Is the lighting a candle, right? Is the lighting a candle so that the midwife can see better? Or is it about something else? So Amar, okay, if the woman needed a lamp, right, obviously, right, if they needed it to see better, to do the door, of course they would light it. So why, it's so obvious, why did the Mishnah have to teach me this? And this is a classic question of you don't have to tell me obvious things. The Mishnah is not in the habit of saying necessarily all the things, even though it does a lot of them. So it's an interesting technique. But why did it need to tell me that? Right? I know that whenever there's a life-saving thing, I can violate Shabbat. So what does this add? What information does this add? This says, no, tzricha. It was needed because, what about a summa? What about a blind woman? A blind woman is in labor and she says, I need a light a candle while I'm in labor and delivering this baby. And you might say, she can't see. The midwife could just say, right? We're not talking about lying now. We're going to talk about that towards the end, right? You don't say, yeah, I lit it and then tell the woman, no, I didn't, right? Because somehow she'll know, right? We don't, the rabbis do not even suggest that, right? How is that going to help this blind woman? And they say, right, we might think it's forbidden. Kamash malan, this comes to teach you, the Mishnah came to teach you, it's actually there to settle her mind, that one can light this lamp on Shabbat for this woman in labor just to settle her mind. Now, what might this do? And it's going to play out sort of how she's understanding this. Right? Svara, she's going to think, okay, if anything needs to be done, she's going to do it for me. Now, there's a couple of ways of understanding this, right? Is it that, anything I ask for, they're going to take me seriously and they're going to do it, right? As a patient advocate, right? Mishnah talking about patient advocacy at a very vulnerable time. Or is it that, no, she's really worried about the logistics, right? The midwife's not going to be able to see, and she has to light the candle, right, so that she can see what she's doing. Any thoughts? If people want to put in the chat or either have what do you sense it one more than the other before we look at the sources? The title of the class might give you a sense of how significant the state of mind is, but what's giving her the peace of mind? Okay, so how far can you take it? Ozzy, what do you mean by that? Can you elaborate on the question?
How far do you take her needs into account? If they're totally unreasonable, you have to cater into that. If she may be Machal Shabbos.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Right. That's a great question. And it's really fascinating to have this test case of a person who clearly doesn't need the light saying, I need the light while I'm in labor. Right. Light it. And then we're allowed to do it. Okay, certainty in an uncertain situation makes you feel better. Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, labor, like you said, it's a very scary situation, but if she's in her home or surrounded by people She knows, like, maybe like seeing familiar surroundings or familiar faces would be calming and like supportive.
Right. So it could be like, even if this case of this woman who the light is not benefiting her by seeing it, she maybe feels that she's in a supportive environment. So this question of how far is really interesting. We're going to look at some of those questions as we go through the sources of how far we actually take this in practice, and how much we should sort of minimize and try to do things in a rabbinic way, or try to like tell the woman, well, we're going to do it this way and that way, and let's not violate Shabbat. And this doesn't necessarily seem to be what's being suggested here, but we all might be familiar with that sort of in these types of things that might not seem medically necessary. So Tosafot, right, on this part of the Gemara says, what does it mean to settle her mind? And he says he's trying to draw a distinction. Now, the Tosafot draw a distinction between what we're used to as a life-saving measure and like what's going on here. So Tosafot points out, even though in the final chapter of Yoma, there's a whole section on pikuach nefesh, they're on saving a life, and right, if somebody says they need to eat, right, and that we might need medical experts in that situation. That's an interesting section, so yeah, to learn on its own, that it's not so simple, right? But that ideally you would have medical experts, right, to actively feed. If the person needs to eat, we don't stop them, right? But to actually actively feed someone, perhaps you need medical experts. But here, it seems like it's permitted to violate Shabbat by lighting a candle just because of Yishuv da'at, just to settle her mind. And he says, well, a laboring woman is different than this other case of somebody who is not feeling well and needs to eat. Because a laboring woman is more susceptible to be endangered through pachad, through fear, through anxiety. If she fears or is anxious that they're actually not doing what she needs properly and they're not taking sufficient care of her, her peace of mind, or her sense that she's in a safe, as some of you were hinting at, in a secure place, that people are doing whatever is needed, any means necessary, that will affect her more than somebody who is ill due to hunger. Right, so it's a question, right? So Avi put about safek, but is this a doubt? We're going to develop that idea of like what's the danger here. The Rambam, but it seems like the Tosafot here say right, this idea of feeling secure that other people, right, minimizing any fear that she might have beyond doing the medical things, minimizing any anxieties or fear that she might have, that people are listening to her and doing what she needs, whatever they need, and paying attention to her needs. The Rambam adds some of the things that can be done on Shabbat here, right? Some of the practical things are, right, once she's in a stage of labor, this is a big discussion of like at what point this is. I think we do this earlier on. We'll see Rob Hankin does. We do this earlier rather than later because things can progress, right? So it doesn't have to be so late in the process, right? That we can violate any, right? For sure she's in sakana, and we can do anything that we need to do on Shabbat, right? We do for this person. You can call a midwife from a distant place, and you can cut the umbilical cord. And if she needs a light, you can light a candle. And then the Rambam says, right? But even if she's blind, because a light is a calming influence, even if she does not see it, right? And if she needs oil and it's brought to her, right? So some things are done in a rabbinic way, right? With a shinoi, even if she needs them. But this light, anything that's like to settle her mind, it's like maybe even biblical violations of lighting a candle can be done, so that so she can feel peace of mind. The Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch also brings this idea in, and says a woman in labor in general is like a cholash yesh b'sakana, right? Again, reaffirming this idea that yes, there is real medical danger here in this case. And when we violate Shabbat, right, whatever is needed. Again, with the words of the right, we call the chachama, the midwife. I love that the midwife is called the chachama. And we light a lamp for her, even though she is blind. And then he also adds this caveat of nevertheless, if you can do something with a shinoi, you should do it. right? So we see this tension here in these sources between, on the one hand, by any means necessary, right? We have, okay, by any means necessary for clear medical need. Then we have things that she needs, but maybe they're not urgent, and we can do it in a rabbinic way, or with a shinoi, with a change, that we're not like violating Shabbat, right? If we can minimize the Shabbat violations for some things, we try to do them. And then we have this case of that's brought down not only as this like weird example in the Gemara, but it's brought down in the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch as this example of the importance of Yishuv dat, or a peace of mind for this woman in labor. And that maybe a candle being lit on Shabbat is like, it's actually one of the two things mentioned in the Torah that you can't do on Shabbat, is lighting a candle. And it seems like this sense of this woman feeling, on the one hand, supported, on the one hand, her needs, whatever she's asking for, are being met, even if we might say that doesn't make any sense, right? Like that's not rational. That's not a rational need. That's not a response that we're being encouraged to, right, give to this woman. Say that's not very rational right now. Like you don't need that right now. So let's focus on the things you do need. Right, that actually is going to cause her to possibly feel really anxious and concerned and then worried that like maybe perhaps her real needs are not being met. If anyone has any additional, we're going to jump into more of the sources, but I want to pause here. I framed it in a certain way in terms of the significance of her Yishuv dat, of her peace of mind. Any other senses of like why this extreme example of violating Shabbat might be okay here? Like what are we worried about? Given that it's clear that, right, there's a tension between keeping Shabbat and taking care of this person and making sure that she's okay and the baby's okay. Yeah.
I have a question, which is like, how is this still relevant today? Basically, when we have like such better healthcare and health outcomes. I know it's like childbirth is still like extremely dangerous situation, but I can think of so many reasons why like someone like panicking when they're like losing blood, or like I can think of so many reasons why like for healthcare reasons you would want someone to be calm in that situation. But I'm not sure how justifiable it still is.
Right. So because we maybe have better healthcare, or people understand the medical processes better, and we sort of can have more technical conversations about things, we're going to look at some modern responsa that look at this question of like, how do we take this idea of, number one, right, see, like doing anything necessary medically, but also this additional idea of the woman in labor saying, I need this right now, even though it violates Shabbat, and like how much do we give into that versus how much do we try to say like this is not a rational thing, like we can do it this way, we can do it that way. So we're going to look at some of those sources. One question that also comes up, because you mentioned panicking, is this a test case in any other way? Right? The Tosfot tries to say like this is different than a lot of those other cases that we looked at of right, taking care of people medically, because there's the mental state and then there's the physical need, but they're so intertwined in this case that we're going to worry about both. And that seems to be what they're working with. And the question is, can you apply that then to other cases? This is a test case for other examples of other illnesses or other medical situations, or is it only in this case? So we're going to look at two modern questions. The first one is clearly if the woman is in labor, right, she can drive to the hospital, she can get driven to the hospital, right, she can violate Shabbat. But what about if she wants someone else with her? Can someone in her husband, right, the question that Moshe Feinstein got was, right, a woman who wants to travel in a taxi on Shabbat to the hospital. Now, of course, her husband also could drive her if he needed to, right? But again, some people try to do things in either they didn't have a car or trying to maybe not violate Shabbat in an extreme way, right? These are questions that also come up. because there's Yishuv dat. She doesn't want to go alone. She needs someone with her, and either her husband or her mother to go with her. Then he says it is permitted in this case that the family member can violate Shabbat on this woman's behalf. And he compares it to similar to lighting a candle, which is permitted even when there's no essential need, and only due to her Yishuv dat. Right? The idea of only, right, is not meaning like, right, clearly that's not only merely if it's being acknowledged as halakhically significant. Okay, so is it the same? He says, I responded that clearly in that case. So now Rav Moshe Feinstein is going to take it. So the question is, can we compare these two cases? Yes, so there's a lot of different opinions on getting to the hospital and how one should get to the hospital and arrange things possibly in advance to not violate Shabbat if it's not necessary. What's interesting is that there seems to be this idea here that Rav Moshe is bringing, and we're going to see read some other sources as well, right? That you need to do what you need to do, right? So thank you for bringing those poskim. So Rav Moshe was asked this question about a family member also going, and he says, in that case, the case of the candle, every person would fear that they won't see what she needs. Even if midwife says, I'm an expert and I don't need the extra candle, certainly she's allowed to not believe her and just say, like, actually, can you just like make me feel better? And just, even though I know you're the expert in the room, like I'm the one giving birth here, I would feel a lot better if you did this. I think it's needed. Can you please do this? Right. So a very strong case of patient advocacy. The Magen Avraham does question, right, why we need Yishuv dat. I didn't bring that source here, but he's the one that sort of pushes back on all of this and says, like, isn't this just a practical thing for the midwife to see? Like, even the blind woman says, I need the midwife to see, so light some extra candles. I want to make sure you have everything you need to take care of me. But then Rav Moshe writes, in any case, according to the law, since we have seen that a woman giving birth may become to endanger herself, right? Because of fear or anxiety, right? Who can rely on these chilukim, on these differentiations, when there's actually a concern of pikuach nefesh, right? If we're going to say that this is actually a real concern, that this question of her state of mind is a real concern, then we're not going to quibble about it. Therefore, if she says, I'm afraid by myself, right? Even if there's not necessarily, it's been explained to her, right? So Rav Moshe, it's interesting, does sort of like do that dance that we did not see in the Gemara of like, first tell the person, like, don't worry, they have all the lights you need, like, you don't actually need this, right? And so this is where these both pastoral and halakhic questions come into play, meaning how much of the, this is not a rational thing, you'll be fine, you don't really need this. How much of that should we be doing? Are the rabbis, right, are these poskim saying, despite the test case? Or in how much of the, like, we don't ask too many questions, we don't make her feel like her needs are not being met. We want her to be in the best possible state of mind, feeling supported and feeling like all her needs are being met. Right, and so that is being played out here in Rav Moshe as well, and we're going to see that in the next responsa. Right, so there seems to be a little bit of a dance going on here. And again, this is not a case where, right, they have to rush to the hospital and everyone has to, as you mentioned, like a rusher, I said, like if you need to go, you need to go, right? This is sort of where those middle ground cases, where it's not, on the one hand, the urgency is not felt there, but she is feeling that urgency. So even if it's been explained, in that case, there is a concern, and her husband or mother must travel with her. And even if she goes to the hospital before she's in a wailing from labor pains, meaning even if it's like not when she's about to deliver the baby, but earlier on in the stage of labor, we've talked about the significance of like how severe does the situation have to be for her state of mind to be significant, right? Do we have to be like towards the delivery, or can even earlier on in the process really affect her? He says, even if it's earlier on, and even if it's far, you should also travel with her, because although she's not in danger at this moment, it's possible it's a very volatile situation. Things can change in a moment, right? And I think that's also part of what's going on here, right? The volatility of the situation. And it could increase. And then there would be really a concern, right? If she's not feeling supported and she's panicked, and right, then that could be really a scary situation, and things might not turn out well. The Encyclopedia Teruf, which is an incredible resource, has a whole section on childbirth. I took a very little snippet for this class, and it says "B'yachas liyoledet," in connection to the childbearing, or to the woman in labor. All laboring women, are in the category of danger, and all prohibitions, all isurim, are pushed aside because of pikuach nefesh. And yeter alken, over and above this, we've seen specifically, even more than other people in the category, other types of individuals who are in danger, and we have pikuach nefesh for them, that we're specifically concerned for a woman in labor, that she will not have teruf da'at, that she won't all of a sudden panic, she won't freak out, she won't be overly anxious, and that's not a state that could be a really add danger to the dangerous situations. So just want to pause to see if people have questions before we move on to the last teshuvah in this section, which is going to require a little bit of introduction, and we'll explore some of these topics more. Is this a new idea? I know people are probably familiar with the idea, if you need to get out of the ambulance, go. But this question of tending to the emotional state, it seems like a very modern, patient-centered approach, which I think just reminds us that human nature has not changed all that much since the time of the Mishnah, the Talmud, Midwives have been delivering babies for thousands of years, and probably understood the importance of the state of mind, and how the emotional strength was going to be called on in that moment, and feeling like things are being taken. I think it also puts extra pressure on those caring for the woman as well, If we're worried about her emotional state, we're less likely to miss anything, We're less likely to overlook any needs as, oh, that's not so important. And we hear that so often that, unfortunately, a lot of the comorbidities that happen after childbirth, or a lot of the morbidity and mortality, is because women's pain, or what they were saying, was not listened to. Women will say this is not okay, or actually no, and it's often not listened to. And so this sort of reinforces that state of there's a lot going on. It's a very volatile situation, and even things we're just gonna go all in. Of course, there's that caveat though that we've seen of, wait, but if we sort of know, as this rational people in the situation, a little bit patronizing, we know it's not so important. How much do we try to convince her that it's not so important? Or are we just supposed to go all in? Yeah, Ronas.
I really like how it kind of opens the door to mental health, crises being treated the same as physical health crises. Yes. And it reminded me of an article I was reading about. I had no idea about this before, that there's a very, very high rate of post-traumatic stress disorder after not even just a lot of women, of people who have hospital, not even necessarily so complicated births, and even if it's not when you were saying about the midwife, she's the expert in the room, but actually, even if she is the expert, we need to have these extra reassurances.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. And I think it's one of the things where we'll see in this last source that there's big giant brakes that are put on this idea. And I having read these sources over the years, I still don't really understand. We'll think about maybe it's sociological, how we've changed the birthing process. But there's many sources, or Moshe was asked, right, about the husband going along. There's many sources where the question is, can the husband be the one who's helping the wife during the delivery, and right, basically being the delivery or being her coach during the delivery, even though it's a time when she might be in nida and there might be issues of touch. Right. So on the one hand, right, nida is an extremely serious prohibition. On the other hand, right, we'll look at one of the sources, but many of the sources will sort of say, try to convince her otherwise, try to make sure she has a backup, right? Like sort of front load the situation so that as much as possible, we don't like try to get into the situation when she says, I need my husband to be that person. But again, like society since the late 70s, right, has changed very much on that front. And that in many couples, it's sort of expected, right, that the husband will be present and be in that situation. And sort of how does the halakha respond to that, especially with these sources? And it's not necessarily an obvious answer, right? Like many poskim will not respond. Oh, of course, if you can light a candle and if you could jump in the car, then we can also have the husband do whatever he needs. And that's not actually the response that's written in many places. I brought Rav Hinken here, who brings a little bit of the background to that question. Okay. So he says, if the woman, this is part of a larger teshuvah from B'nai Banim. I put the link here. It's all on Safari. It's, I think, mostly translated if people want to read it on their own. If the woman is afraid, there's a whole footnote here where Rav Hinken discusses like those who try to minimize and try to like say, like, don't get her to the point where she says, like, this is what I need, and if I don't have this, it's not going to work, and try to like come up with other solutions. But no, she wants her husband to be present with her. We don't need to find grounds to permit him to be with her in the delivery room. And in my humble opinion, not only can he be there, right? Not only mutar, he must be there because of the threat to her life. And our sages have held the fear of a birthing mother to be a danger to life. And can even violate Shabbat to prevent her fear, as we saw, and then he quotes, right, what we've previously learned in the Mishnah and the Gemara. Even lighting a candle on Shabbat for a woman who cannot see the candle and is only concerned for a possible complication is permitted in order to comfort her mind, even though she has no physical benefit from it. The rule is the same here, that if she fears being without her husband, he is obligated to be with her, and this, in short, is halakha. He goes down into right, some discussion of a lot of the background, because this was not the obvious answer that was being given in most cases, and which is why Rav Hinken felt the need to bring this forward. He again says, right, it doesn't need to be so late in the stage, right? It can be earlier on in labor. Right, so we'll talk about the touch question, right? He doesn't discuss the touch directly. There are other concerns there of actually just being present for the birth and right, witnessing the baby, which are those are three separate questions, right? Being in the room, right, assisting in some way, and then right, watching or witnessing the baby coming out, are all different concerns. He explains, but I think to your question, I think there are, right, most poskim who have written about this in writing will say, right, that the husband may not be like the coach in a physical way, despite what we've seen in the sources previously of the other violations of Shabbat, right, that violations of Nidah might be different. But I think in a one-on-one situation, that people are receiving different psak. And part of bringing these sources forward is just to help us frame that question as well and think about that question, especially for those who it feels like that would actually be right, significant to them. So what's interesting here is that he explains two different types of Teruf da'at. The first is when the person actually feels like okay, I'm physically afraid. Like something is really bad is going to happen. And right, if this doesn't happen, right, I'm actually going to die. Right. So that's one settling of the mind. Right. The second type is when an ill person is so distressed and worried that their words will not be upheld. We're stepping aside a little bit from the laboring woman just to get some background, right? That there's Teruf that, right, if a person feels like unrelated to their body. For example, somebody who is on their deathbed and they feel like their time is limited. Right. So that the idea brought there is that maybe there's certain things we can do so that he doesn't have Teruf dad or she doesn't have Teruf dad, knowing that people are not going to uphold their final wishes. Right? There's no life-threatening danger at all in the second type. So for the Rambam did not permit even rabbinic acts of like acquisition or giving or selling and buying. Through this, we've also gained, according to the other Rishonim who disagree with the Rambam and think like the Rashban, that even in places where an active acquisition is necessary, it's permissible from someone who is imminently dying in order for their mind to not have Teruf that. But even then, they only permitted rabbinic level violations of Shabbat, right? Because it's not actual sakana, right? It's not life-threatening danger, so we wouldn't have biblical violations of Shabbat, right? And he brings some examples here. For example, Yoredea 339 has many of these rules. If people are interested in looking there or find somebody who's imminently dying is permitted to issue divorce on Shabbat, right? Which normally we do not do that on Shabbat. So that their mind, they will not have Teruf that. But in general, it was only rabbinic level prohibitions. But what's interesting is that the Teruf dot of the woman seems to be of the first type and not the second type, right? It's not merely so that they'll feel peace of mind and that they'll settle in peace, but not danger, but it seems to be of the first type. Right? And he towards the end of Pinkin says, in my humble opinion, right? God and the sages recognized how a birthing mother is different from someone with a life-threatening illness. An ill person just needs to rest and eat what they're given, and healing. So this might also, we can think about how this might apply to others. Rav Hinkin does discuss this of whether the Ramban might think this is a test case for others, like whether this could be used in other cases, or whether it's specific to a Yoledet because of he's going to explain here why it might be different. The birthing mother who must herself deliver the baby, right? It's not that, right? The body needs to do so much, which is hard work. It's hard labor, incomparable to any other challenge in the life of a man or woman, as is known. If she pushes when she should be resting, or does not push when she should push, she will be exhausting her strength and actually endangering herself. And she requires a settled mind in order to listen to the instructions of the midwife or expert during the birth. If she does not have a settled mind during the time of the contractions, meaning earlier on, she'll also not during the time she actually needs to deliver the baby. Thus, a woman exhausts her strength if she does not have the emotional calm to rest while she's experiencing pain. Right. Also, he notes here that fear of pain is actually a big, right? That's also a huge anxiety and fear, right? The fear of extreme pain, which is right, very present in this situation. And perhaps that's why the Rambam also says we can do it earlier on, right? Because of the eventuality that she's going to have to deliver the baby. So that's our first case, which I know is the majority of the sources, just to develop this idea of Yishuv da'at, of peace of mind, and Teruf da'at, of what it means to be panicked or anxiety in these particular cases. Now this was a medical case, which is why it goes into those different directions and why there's so much gray area. There's a very interesting source also on violating Shabbat. This is in the introduction of sort of the second area that we're going to look at, that the Gemara asks if a child gets locked behind a door, like a small child that's left behind the door and they can't get out, and they're really, right? They're scared, right? They're by themselves on the other side of the door. Right? What do we do? And so I put the full Shulchan Aruch here in the notes. That's why I did a Word document if people wanted to look at where the Mishnah Berurah is commenting on here. But one can, if the child falls out of well, and anything like you can violate Shabbat, even in a way that's possibly constructive, right? Not just destructive. And anything that's like that. And the Mishnah Berurah says, for example, if the door is locked in front of a child, we break the door and take them out, even though it splits the door and appears like a forbidden Shabbat activity to make planks or chips for kindling, right? You're sort of making wood. Even so, the breaking is permitted, lest the child become extremely frightened and, God forbid, die from fear. Or maybe come like confused, right? The child will come disoriented maybe, and like, in those scary moments, like who knows what could happen, right? And so this is an extreme urgent situation perhaps. And we don't say it's possible to like make some noise outside the door and just like keep the child talking and like let them know that we're there to try to distract them, right? Until somebody comes with the key, right? That actually one should break the door. Now, one would of course use their best judgment in these cases, but this is another example of sort of where fear is a motivator in the situation, right? The anxiety and like the deep fear in the situation allows Shabbat to be violated. The last sources we're going to look at this idea of Teruf Dat from Rabbi Jason Weiner's book on practical medical decision making. A question of, are we concerned for Teruf Dat, of panicking or like kind of tearing up someone's mind or throwing them off completely, like a deep sense of throwing them off by sharing medical information. We're going to spend a few minutes on this. This is a deep topic that I think people might have had the opportunity to learn with Rav Jason Weiner, and people can definitely look at his book and see it there. And it's not an easy question, but important to sort of think about through this lens, and also just establishes this question, right? How much are we concerned for somebody's state of mind? So I'm going to share the source. Let me know if you can see it. People can see it? Okay. So he shares a story. Rav Levi Meyer of blessed memory, my predecessor at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, relates the following anecdote in his book, Second Chances. Dr. Mark, a psychiatrist on staff at a hospital, was diagnosed with a terminal illness. His attending physician felt that it would not be in Dr. Mark's best interest to know how much time he had left to live. But Dr. Mark persisted, saying, I'm a psychiatrist. I can handle any news you're going to give me. I want the whole truth, and I want it now. So his physician told him, you know you've got cancer, and it's stage 4. I don't think you have more than 6 or 7 months left. Dr. Mark thought he assimilated all this information well, and that he could grasp it intellectually. But he was wrong. Soon after hearing this, he fell into severe depression, and soon after that, he died. This question of delivering medical news at certain times, in certain ways, how much information, is a huge medical ethics question. And we're just going to touch the surface of it through thinking about this idea of how much we're concerned for Teruf Dat, or how much do the rabbis or Halakhah give a sense of a person's state of mind affecting their physical state, right? Their ability to deal with whatever medical challenges they have. So Jason writes here, truth-telling poses a very common and challenging issue in healthcare, and that although there was a time that maybe people it was customary not to share as much information or disclose as much of serious diagnosis, now, there is much more of, that people are given the truth. It's become generally accepted in contemporary healthcare that patients have a right to know all relevant information. related to their health condition. Right? Does Jewish law support such a stance of complete disclosure? Does it advocate limiting truth-telling in situations? Right. So on the one hand, truth is very, very important, right? But there are many biblical stories. The very painful or shocking information can have a significant impact on physical health and well-being. Right. The idea of tza'ar is a prime example of that. Death after the Akedah. Similarly, there's a fundamental concept in Jewish law known as Teruf hadat, or acute mental anguish. Right, the Jewish law sometimes permits violation of even biblical commandments, right, in order to put a patient's peace of mind, right, and we saw some of those examples. I want to bring some more of those examples in the footnotes. Just close to my screen, sorry. Okay, so for example, the Shulchan Aruch rules that if a close family member of a dangerously ill patient has died, the patient should not be informed of this bad news, since it may cause great anguish and exacerbate their illness. Right, even if that patient might not be able to do any of the traditional mourning practices, right, and maybe the other family members will have to avoid mourning practices. Right, maybe there are certain situations where one, right, should not share that news, and maybe even actively lie if asked to rescue by the patient. So there's been right, a difference of opinion, right, noted here in the poskim, right, that some have counseled against, while others have said that, right, it might be impossible or counterproductive, right, because now patients not only, right, the mental state is also dealt with, right, meaning patients not only receive physical care, but also, right, receive mental health care and are, right, to bring them through the process. So he discusses maybe it should be done in stages, right, meaning the idea of caring for the medical state, for the mental state of the person. Right, the conclusion being here that it's on a case-by-case basis, right, that those in medical ethics physicians and doctors and Halakhah take the mental state of the person or the peace of mind of the person in as to be something to be seriously considered, right, as affecting their ability to take care, like to be cared for also physically. You know, we only touched on just a little bit of the idea of Yishuv and tza'ar, but you can see from the sources that actually it touches on a wide number of situations that affect both the beginning of life and end of life, right? How much a person's peace of mind and how much a fear of that they will not have peace of mind or not be listened to or not be advocated for, and that it's not an easy, that it's not a clear-cut, right, cases. Even though the Mishnah we first learned seems like it's so clear-cut, many of those we looked at is that, right, it's somewhat of a delicate balance, right? How do we judge the situation? How do we judge the person's state? And then how do we act accordingly on a case-by-case basis, right? Which requires much more delicacy and care, both in knowing the halakha, but also knowing the individuals and what they particularly need in that situation, right? What would be useful to them in what they're facing. I wanted to thank everybody for joining for the series. I think all of the recordings for the previous 4 sessions and the source sheet should be on the website. It's been wonderful learning with you. And Lonas, thank you. I enjoyed we're so masterfully not only administrating, but also it's really been a joy to learn together for these sessions. And I appreciate all of your participation.
Yes, thank you so much, Rabbanit Sutton. This has been a really amazing series, Halakhah through a whole new lens of like emotions and psychological experience. Before we go, as Rabbanit Sutton said, you can sign up for her class next week at the same time. Wishing everyone a great week, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.